Old women like her don't matter anymore. My son didn't know I was standing just outside the conference room door when he whispered it. He thought he'd lowered his voice enough. He hadn't. The executives around the polished walnut table exchanged awkward glances. A few forced polite smiles, pretending they hadn't heard him. One young marketing manager stared down at his notebook as if the paper might rescue him from the moment. I stood there for another 3 seconds, not because I was hurt, because I wanted to hear whether anyone would challenge him. No one did. I opened the door. The room fell silent. My son Daniel looked up first. 38 years old, handsome in the effortless way expensive tailoring can create, confident enough to mistake admiration for authority. His greatest strength was charm. His greatest weakness was believing charm could replace discipline. "Mom," he said, surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." I gathered that. His smile tightened. The other executives slowly stood. Not for me. Out of habit. I'd spent 30 years attending shareholder meetings before retiring 6 years earlier. Most of them remembered that. Some had started their careers under me. I carried a simple leather notebook and set it gently on the conference table. "I'm sorry to interrupt." Daniel laughed. "We're actually discussing the company's future." "I know." He leaned back. "We're trying to modernize things." "I'm aware." He nodded toward an empty chair. "You can sit in if you'd like." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Daniel mistook their discomfort for agreement. "I appreciate everything your generation built," he continued. "But business is different now." "It is. We have to move faster." "I agree. We can't keep listening to outdated thinking." I smiled. Then today should be very educational. The confidence in his expression flickered for the first time. "What does that mean?" "You'll see." I took the empty seat nearest the end of the table. No anger. No lecture. No argument. Only patience. Because experience had taught me something Daniel hadn't learned yet. The strongest position in a negotiation belongs to the person who already knows the ending. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 72 years old. My silver hair reaches my shoulders because my late husband loved it that way, and after 50 years together I never found a reason to cut it shorter. People often describe me as quiet. That's accurate. Quiet people hear things loud people miss. I spent 35 years building Whitmore Technologies beside my husband, Charles. He designed industrial software. I built the business. He loved invention. I loved systems, payroll, vendor negotiations, bank financing, acquisitions, insurance, compliance. Charles was the engine. I was the transmission. After he died 8 years ago, everyone assumed I inherited his wealth. Very few understood something important. Half of it had always been mine. Daniel was my only child. As a little boy, he'd follow me through the office carrying a toy briefcase almost as big as he was. He'd shake hands with receptionists, ask accountants what they were doing, pretend to approve imaginary contracts. Employees adored him. So did I. Somewhere along the way, admiration became expectation. Expectation became entitlement. Not overnight. Quietly. Dangerously. His wife Melissa encouraged it. She was 36, intelligent, polished, and endlessly concerned with status. She wasn't cruel by nature. She simply believed successful people deserve different rules than everyone else. Her greatest fear was appearing ordinary. Her greatest weakness was confusing image with achievement. Together they looked like success. Unfortunately, looking successful and building success are two different professions. After the meeting ended, I drove home instead of confronting Daniel. My home sat on 12 wooded acres outside the city, large enough to impress strangers, small enough to feel peaceful. Margaret, my executive assistant for 24 years before we both retired, still visited every Thursday for coffee. She arrived precisely at 2. "You heard him." I did. She didn't ask how I felt. She knew better. Instead she asked, "What are you going to do?" I smiled. "The same thing I've always done." "Which is?" "Read the paperwork." She laughed softly. I should have guessed. My study occupied the quietest room in the house. Cherry bookshelves. Old brass desk lamp. One fireproof filing cabinet. Second drawer. Whitmore Family Holdings. I unlocked it. Inside sat the documents almost no one remembered existed. Trust agreements, share certificates, voting rights, corporate bylaws, board resolutions. The final binder contained something Daniel had apparently forgotten. Class of voting shares. 61%. Owner. Eleanor Whitmore. Not the trust. Not the company. Me. Charles had insisted on it years earlier. If anything happens to me, he'd said, I don't want anyone pushing you aside. I closed the binder. Then opened another. Executive compensation. Expense reports. Corporate card summaries. Board attendance. If Daniel wanted to discuss the future, we were going to begin with the present. The following morning I called Grace Holloway. Grace was 63, Whitmore Technologies' chief financial officer for 14 years. Sharp-eyed, methodical, impossible to intimidate. She cared very little for office politics and a great deal for balanced ledgers. Grace. Eleanor. I need copies of executive expense reports. She paused. Current year. 3 years. I'll have them delivered. No explanations. I understand. She hesitated. Does this involve Daniel? It involves governance. That's answer enough. By noon 3 archive boxes arrived at my front door. I carried them into the study myself. People imagine revenge begins with shouting. Mine always begins with accounting. I opened the first folder. Corporate credit card. Private club memberships. Luxury travel upgrades. Consulting invoices. Everything properly documented. Everything properly approved. Which meant one thing. If there was a problem, it wouldn't be hidden in missing paperwork. It would be hiding inside perfectly legal paperwork that nobody had questioned. I sharpened my pencil. Turned the first page. And halfway through the first month's statements, one recurring payment caught my attention. The amount wasn't enormous. The company could easily afford it. But the name attached to the payments was one I had never approved. I circled it once, then reached for the vendor file. Something told me this wasn't going to end with a single invoice. The vendor file wasn't where it should have been. That bothered me more than the payment itself. Whitmore Technologies had survived 4 recessions, 2 acquisitions, and 1 cyber attack because our records were obsessive. Nothing simply disappeared. I pressed the intercom on my desk. Margaret. Her familiar voice answered immediately. Yes. Would you come in for a moment? She entered carrying her notebook, exactly as she had thousands of times before retirement when she occasionally helped organize my personal archives. What did you find? I slid the statement across the desk. This vendor. She adjusted her glasses. Evergreen Strategic Partners. Her forehead wrinkled. I don't remember them. Neither do I. How much? I pointed to the highlighted line. $18,750. She flipped to the following month. Another payment. Then another. 12 consecutive months. Exactly the same amount. $225,000 a year, she murmured. Correct. What do they do? That's what I'd like to know. By late afternoon, Grace Holloway arrived carrying another banker's box. I anticipated your next question. She smiled faintly. Inside were procurement records, vendor onboarding forms, conflict of interest disclosures, competitive bid documentation. I opened the index. Every approved vendor had a file. Every file had signatures, insurance certificates, tax identification, bank verification. Except Evergreen. There was a purchase order. There were invoices. There were payments. There was no competitive review. No conflict disclosure. No board authorization. Grace folded her hands. I checked twice. And the payments were approved directly through the CEO's office. Daniel. I wrote his name on a yellow legal pad. Not as an accusation. As a question. Questions keep emotions out of important decisions. The next morning became what Charles always called a ledger day. I reviewed everything connected to executive authority, corporate credit cards, signing authority, vendor approval thresholds, travel reimbursement limits, consulting contracts, insurance authorizations. Nothing dramatic, just systems. One by one I made notes. Executive purchasing above $25,000 required 2 signatures. Consulting contracts over $100,000 required board notification. Conflict of interest forms required annual renewal. Then I compared policy with practice. 3 executive credit cards had no spending cap. 1 belonged to Daniel. I highlighted it. Executive assistants still had authority to approve emergency wire transfers. I circled it. Vendor onboarding bypassed procurement. Whenever the CEO marked a project, strategic. Another circle. None of these policies had been illegal. They had simply relied on trust. Trust without verification eventually becomes risk. I wrote another list. Freeze unlimited corporate card. Require dual authorization for consulting invoices. Move vendor approval back to procurement. Audit executive consulting contracts from previous 36 months. I didn't issue the changes. Not yet. First I wanted answers. At 10 o'clock the following Monday, Daniel walked into my study. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Mom. Morning. He noticed the archive boxes immediately. Working on something? Yes. He laughed. Still can't stay away from paperwork. It has served me well. He sat without being invited. I've actually been meaning to ask you something. Go ahead. The board wants to modernize governance.
I'm listening.
We're thinking about reducing voting control. I kept my face perfectly still. Explain. Concentrated ownership slows decisions. So you'd like more flexibility? Exactly. For whom? He smiled. The executive team. Interesting. Not the shareholders. Not the company. The executives. I folded my hands. And how would that happen? We'd ask major shareholders to voluntarily reduce voting power. I see. He leaned forward. It would make the company more attractive to investors. Would it? Absolutely. I reached into the fireproof cabinet, removed a leather binder, placed it gently on the desk. Daniel glanced at the cover. Class of voting share register. His smile faded slightly. I haven't seen that in years. I know. I opened it to the signature page. Owner. Eleanor Whitmore. Voting control. 61%. He stared at the page, then looked back at me. I thought those shares were in the family trust. No. Dad always said. Your father said many things. I closed the binder. This is one of the few he put in writing. Daniel shifted in his chair. So, you still control the vote? Yes. For now. I smiled politely. There is no for now. Silence settled between us. Then he laughed. Well, I suppose one day it'll all be mine anyway. I looked directly into his eyes. That assumption is exactly why we're having this conversation. For the first time since entering the room, his confidence cracked. Only slightly, but enough for me to see it. Before he could respond, Margaret knocked gently and stepped inside. Eleanor. She held a sealed envelope. It came from procurement. I accepted it. Opened the seal. Inside was the missing vendor file for Evergreen Strategic Partners. Except it wasn't complete. Half the documents had been removed, and the signature on the remaining approval page wasn't Daniel's. It belonged to someone much higher in the chain of authority. Someone whose name should never have appeared on a consulting invoice. I looked up slowly, because suddenly, this wasn't just about my son anymore. I turned the page over. Then I turned it back. Sometimes your eyes refuse to believe what they've already seen. The signature belonged to Charles Whitmore, my late husband. Daniel frowned. What is it? I didn't answer immediately. Grace reached for the document. After only a few seconds, she quietly said, "That signature isn't original." Daniel looked confused. What do you mean? Grace placed the paper flat on my desk. The ink is modern. The document is supposedly 12 years old. She pointed toward the lower right corner. And Charles stopped signing his name that way nearly 20 years before he passed away. I leaned closer. She was right. When Charles developed arthritis, he shortened his signature dramatically. Every legal document after that reflected the change. This one didn't. Someone had copied an older signature. Poorly. The room became very still. Daniel looked genuinely shaken. Mom, I didn't do this. I know. You believe me?
Ido.
His relief lasted only a second. Then another realization hit him. If I didn't, then who approved the payments? Grace answered. Someone wanted it to appear that your father had. Daniel stared at the forged signature. I've never even seen this contract. I believed him. Not because he was my son, because his flaws were obvious. Arrogance, impatience, entitlement. Forgery wasn't one of them. People rarely change every part of themselves overnight. Martin Ellis arrived within the hour. He reviewed the paperwork without speaking. Then he removed a magnifying glass from his briefcase. 5 minutes later he leaned back. This isn't complicated. No. He tapped the page. This approval sheet was assembled. What do you mean? The signature page came from one document. The consulting agreement from another. The staple holes don't even line up. Grace nodded. I noticed that. Martin continued. Someone expected nobody to compare originals. I asked the obvious question. Who had access? Grace answered carefully. Very few. She wrote 4 names on my legal pad. Chief Financial Officer. General Counsel. Chief Executive Officer. Board Chairman. Only 4 people. One name was already impossible. Charles. One sat across from me. Daniel. One stood beside my desk. Grace. And one made my stomach tighten. Richard Langford. Richard was 71. Board chairman. Impeccably dressed. Polished. Respected. He'd worked beside Charles for nearly 30 years. He attended our anniversary parties. He carried Daniel at Charles's funeral because my son had been too devastated to walk steadily. I trusted him completely. Which is exactly why I refused to accuse him without proof. Trust deserves evidence. Distrust deserves evidence too. I called an emergency governance meeting. Not a full board meeting. Just the audit committee. 3 independent directors. Martin. Grace. Myself. Richard arrived 10 minutes late. Still smiling. Eleanor. Richard. He noticed the archive boxes. Cleaning house. In a way. He laughed. What seems to be the emergency? Grace slid the consulting file toward him. We have questions. He barely glanced at it. What about it? The signature. Oh. He waved a dismissive hand. Old paperwork. No. Grace's voice remained flat. It's forged. His smile disappeared. Only for a heartbeat. Then it returned. I seriously doubt that. Martin pushed a second folder across the table. Forensic comparison. Richard didn't open it. Interesting. Most innocent people immediately examine evidence. He didn't. Instead he asked, who else has seen this? Only everyone in this room. He nodded slowly. Good. Not how did this happen? Not we should investigate. Good. I made another quiet note in my mind. Then Richard looked directly at Daniel. I assume your mother thinks you approved it. Daniel answered before I could. No. I've never seen it. Richard smiled sympathetically. These things happen when companies grow. Grace folded her hands. No. They happen when controls fail. Richard looked irritated. Let's not overreact. I finally spoke. How much has Evergreen Strategic Partners received? Grace answered without looking down. $3,375,000 over 15 years. The room fell silent. Richard blinked once. Apparently, he hadn't expected us to calculate the total. I opened another folder. Bank records. Wire transfers. Vendor ownership filings. Annual disclosures. Then I placed one single sheet in front of Richard. Would you explain this? He looked down. Didn't touch it. The filing listed Evergreen Strategic Partners beneficial owner. Not a corporation. Not an investment fund. A family trust. Langford Family Holdings. Richard's family. Nobody moved. Daniel slowly turned toward the chairman. You own the consulting company? Richard answered carefully. My family does. You never disclosed that. It wasn't required. Martin spoke for the first time in several minutes. It absolutely was. Richard's confidence cracked. Just enough. He straightened his tie. I can explain. I hope you can. Because for the first time all afternoon, he looked less like the chairman of the board, and more like a man calculating how much of the truth he could afford to admit. Before he spoke again, the conference room door opened. The corporate secretary hurried inside, visibly nervous. Eleanor. What is it? She swallowed. The full board is already gathering downstairs. I frowned. I didn't call a board meeting. No. She hesitated, then looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Whitmore did. Daniel stared at her. I most certainly did not. She held up the official notice. It announced an emergency shareholder vote. Agenda Item 1. Removal of Eleanor Whitmore as controlling chairwoman. Every director in the building had already received it. Someone wasn't trying to hide anymore. Someone had decided it was time to take the company. And the vote was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. Daniel pushed back his chair so quickly it struck the wall. I didn't send that notice. I believed him. Not because he was my son. Because whoever had forged Charles's signature had just forged Daniel's authority as well. Richard didn't look surprised. He looked inconvenienced. There is a difference. Grace noticed it too. She leaned toward me and whispered, "Watch him." I already was. We walked downstairs together. The executive boardroom occupied the top floor of Whitmore Technologies. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Charles and I had spent decades building our company inside. 24 directors had already taken their seats. Conversations stopped the moment I entered. Some looked confused. Others looked nervous. Richard walked in behind us as though nothing unusual had happened. The corporate secretary stood beside the projector. Eleanor. I was instructed to begin. By whom? She looked toward Richard. The chairman. Richard smiled politely. Corporate governance requires efficiency. Martin spoke before I could. Only when governance is legitimate. The room grew quiet. Richard remained standing. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached an important moment in this company's history. He sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. For Whitmore Technologies to compete globally, we need younger leadership. Several directors nodded cautiously, not agreeing, listening. Richard continued. Eleanor has served this company admirably. There was that word. Served. Past tense. But we cannot allow sentiment to delay progress. I remained seated, hands folded, notebook closed. No interruption. Silence is powerful when everyone expects outrage. Richard gestured toward Daniel. Our CEO represents the future. Daniel stood immediately. I'd like the record to show. I did not request this meeting. Richard's smile faded. You don't have to be modest. I'm not being modest. I didn't authorize it. Murmurs spread around the room. One director frowned. What exactly is happening? Another added. I thought Daniel requested this vote. Daniel shook his head. I found out 20 minutes ago. The atmosphere shifted. Only slightly, but enough. Richard recovered quickly. It doesn't matter who called the meeting. Martin stood. It matters legally. He held up a binder. According to Article 7 of the corporate bylaws, an emergency removal vote requires either the chairwoman's consent or signatures from 60% of independent directors. He looked around the room. Neither exists. Several board members exchanged glances. Richard interrupted. We can ratify the procedure afterward. Martin smiled. No, you can't. Grace placed another folder on the conference table. And before any governance discussion, the audit committee has identified an undisclosed related party transaction totaling $3,375,000. Every conversation stopped instantly. Richard looked at Grace. This is neither the time nor place. Grace answered without emotion. It's exactly the time. And exactly the place. She distributed copies. One to every director. Vendor records. Bank transfers. Ownership filings. Conflict of interest disclosures. Or rather, the absence of disclosures. A director named Susan Patel adjusted her glasses. Richard. Does your family own Evergreen Strategic Partners? He hesitated. Indirectly. Another director looked up. Why wasn't this disclosed? It wasn't material. Grace replied before anyone else could. It exceeded the disclosure threshold by approximately $3 million. The room became deathly quiet. Richard finally raised his voice. This is political. No. I spoke for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. It's accounting. He turned toward me. You planned this. I reviewed records. You've been trying to embarrass me. No. I've been trying to understand why company money kept leaving without proper governance. His jaw tightened. Then Richard made the mistake that ended everything. He pointed directly at me. You've been slowing this company down for years. Nobody answered. He kept going. Charles would have stepped aside. I looked at him steadily. You don't get to speak for my husband. His expression hardened. You've been clinging to control because you're afraid. Afraid of what? Becoming irrelevant. The room waited. I smiled. I've owned 61% of this company for 31 years. I don't need a title to remain relevant. I need integrity. Then I opened my notebook. Inside was one document. A shareholder resolution. Signed. Dated. Witnessed. Charles's signature. Original. Not copied. Not forged. I slid it across the table. Martin read it aloud. In the event evidence of fraud, undisclosed conflicts of interest, or fiduciary misconduct involving any board officer is discovered, the controlling shareholder may immediately suspend that officer pending independent investigation. Richard's confidence vanished. He stared at the page. I've never seen that. I nodded. I know. Charles never showed you. I uncapped my fountain pen. Signed the suspension order. One signature. Nothing dramatic. No raised voice. No celebration. Just ink. Martin looked toward the corporate secretary. Please record that Richard Langford is suspended immediately. She nodded. Hands shaking. Richard stood abruptly. You can't do this. I just did. You'll destroy this company. I answered quietly. No. I've spent 35 years protecting it. Security stepped into the room. Not because I called them. Because Grace already had. Richard looked around the board table. Searching for allies. He found none. Not one director stood beside him. As he was escorted toward the door, he stopped beside Daniel. This company will eat you alive. Daniel looked him in the eye. No. It almost let you. Richard left without another word. The meeting continued. Not with speeches. With votes. Independent forensic auditors. Approved unanimously. Corporate governance reforms. Approved unanimously. Executive spending controls. Approved unanimously. Then I stood. I have one final item. Every director looked toward me. I'll be retiring as executive chair effective 90 days from today. Daniel looked surprised. So soon? Yes. But before I do, I placed another document in front of him. Not a promotion. Not a gift. A 3-year leadership performance agreement. Quarterly independent reviews. No unlimited spending authority. No unilateral vendor approvals. Board oversight. Exactly the standards every executive should meet. Daniel smiled. Not the confident smile he'd worn at the beginning of this story. A humbler one. I'll earn it. I know. That was the first time I'd been able to say those words without wondering whether they were true. If there's one lesson my life has taught me, it's this. Never mistake quiet people for powerless people. The loudest person in the room often wants attention. The calmest person usually has the facts. Wealth can be inherited. Titles can be granted. But integrity must be earned every single day. So tell me, if you had heard your own child say, "Old women don't matter anymore," would you have walked away? Or would you have let the truth do the talking?